Welcome back, guys. It's Israel. As backend developers, I'm sure we have all created our fair share of REST APIs. But did you know that isn't the only way to create APIs? Did you know that you could harness GraphQL to create a more flexible and efficient way to fetch data from APIs? Unlike REST APIs, where you might need multiple endpoints and requests to get your data, GraphQL allows you to specify exactly what data you want in one query, which leads to faster queries and better user experience on the front end. So let me explain more about what is GraphQL and the terminology, and then I will show you how you can replace your traditional .NET CRUD REST API with a .NET GraphQL API. So let's go. But real quick, just want to give a shout out to all my channel members. If you guys want to see your name here, as well as get access to all the code from all my videos, please click the link in the description or the join button on my profile and then send an email to this email right here with the code that you want access to. But now, on to GraphQL. So here we are, GraphQL. What is it? Let's get into it. So what is GraphQL? It was created by Facebook and is used by many big companies. It can be a complete alternative to traditional REST APIs. It can, though, also work on top of a REST API as a query language. It's not tied to any DB or storage, so it can query multiple data sources at once and present the data as one graph. It's better for complex data requests, not basic CRUD operations, but obviously it's good to know how all these different types of requests would work. Examples of good use cases would be when you have a bunch of nested fields or multiple data sources, and we'll see an example of the nested fields in a bit. It can make one trip for data where a REST API might need to make multiple, and that's one of the great benefits. And you can also pass in values when fetching as well for specific results, but unlike REST and GraphQL, every field and nested object can get arguments, and we will see that later. So let's get into some terminology, because for those of you that have maybe never worked in GraphQL, some of these terms might be foreign to you. So first, graphs. There are modeling done with GraphQL to represent the layout of data. Essentially, it's all your models or a DB context or some of that stuff. That's what would be the graph. A resolver is a function or method that returns a value for a field of type in a schema. It's responsible for fetching all the data and returning it how it's expected. Think of this as a specific function that GraphQL is hitting depending on what's passed in the body or the query, right, that you're sending in the body of your request. It then gets matched to a specific function within your API, and that's resolving the query essentially that's coming in from the front end. And we will see that when we get to the API, it'll make a little bit more sense. Next up is mutations. These allow for data to be created, updated, or deleted. These also usually have variables that you pass into the server so that you can actually then do the create, update, or delete. So mutations, just think of it as you are mutating or changing the database by hitting these functions. By actually doing a post, a put, or a delete, you're mutating the data in the database or you're changing it. Next up is an operation name. It's basically just a method name in GraphQL. Then we have directives. Directives can affect how a query executes, essentially having to match conditions to pull certain data. Next, we have modeling in GraphQL. So we have schema, that is the shape of the data in an API. So this would be like your models or your DB context, anything that says about the structure of your data, that is your schema. So a resolver would be used to get the user settings. Since maybe all you get is an ID, you need to go and then get that user settings. So the resolver makes sure you have all the data and it's organized in the schema. Now I just want to go over some quick differences between REST and GraphQL. I'm not going to read all through them. If you want to read the whole chart, pause the video. But essentially, GraphQL, you get all your data from one endpoint. You get exactly what you need. It's obviously more efficient because you're only getting exactly the data that you wanted, but you do have to learn the querying language. While with REST, you might have to hit multiple endpoints or you might get extra data. It's easier to use and easier for slightly simpler systems that don't have complex data types. But now let's continue on with how you would actually use this in your .NET API. So how do you use GraphQL with .NET? A great option, and the one that I'm going to be using, is Hot Chocolate, which is a GraphQL library made for .NET. Another option is GraphQL.NET if you want to go that route, but preferably in everywhere that I read, Hot Chocolate is a preferred way to go. It's better managed and it gets more updates and it's easier to use versus GraphQL.NET was a lot more confusing when I tried to read through it and apparently doesn't get as many updates and stuff like that. So Hashura is an open source GraphQL platform that auto-generates GraphQL from REST APIs. If you're interested in that, wanted to mention it. And GraphQL, and I want to mention, was built with the front end in mind to allow them to query and mutate data without needing multiple endpoints from the backend API. It kind of gives the front end the ability to query for exactly what it wants. From your front end or Postman, all you have to do on request is hit the GraphQL endpoint, and then in the body, send the query as a JSON. But now let's add it to our .NET API. All right, guys, so we are at the project. I'm going to be using a .NET 8 API that I've used in previous videos, but for those of you that are new, I'm going to run the API just so you guys can see what we have here. So we were working with Pokemon data in a SQL database, and we have the very basic get, create, edit, and delete endpoints. So on top of this API, I'm gonna, in its own section, do GraphQL. So you guys can see that if you maybe want to take your current REST API and migrate it to GraphQL, it is very doable. If it in your situation, GraphQL is better for you. But now let's move on to actually installing and getting working GraphQL with your .NET API. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is install Hot Chocolate so that we can use it in our .NET environment. So we're going to need to look up Hot Chocolate, and then it's going to be .ASP.NET Core. So once you find that, this is the one, hotchocolate.ASP.NET Core. That's the one we're going to want to install into our API. And just for your information, hotchocolate.ASP.NET Core is compatible with all new .NET versions, so you don't have to worry about .NET 8 not being compatible with it or something else. Next, we're going to want hotchocolate.data and install this one right here. And finally, the last one that we're going to need is going to be for entity framework. So it's going to be .data.entity framework, and it should pop up right here. So it's going to be this one, hotchocolate.data.entity framework, and install that one as well. And these are the three packages that we're going to need to actually get Hot Chocolate and be able to use GraphQL in this project. So the next thing I want you guys to go ahead and do is create a folder called data. So we're going to go here, new folder, and we're going to call it data. Inside of here, we're going to create a class called query. So once you've created this query class, in here is where we're going to do all of our querying. So not any mutations, so we're not going to be posting, editing, or deleting. In here is where we're going to do all of our gets. So just straight querying, all of those resolvers are going to be in here. So let's do the first very basic one. And which one would that be? If we go to our Pokemon controller, we can see that we just have a get Pokemon right here. So how can we mimic this functionality? Well, let's write that in the query class. So the code to do that endpoint is going to be this one. So it's going to be public async task. We're going to return a list of Pokemon, and we're going to do get Pokemon. We're going to pass in this service right here. This service is our DB context. That's going to be passed in right here. And I'll explain a little bit more what's going on right here in a bit. And then we're just going to return our DB context Pokemon's table, and we're going to include the region, type, and to list. And with me showing you this code, I want to go over the models and the database that we're using just so you guys understand a little bit more the structure that I have. So I'm going to open up SQL Server Manager right here, and you guys are going to see that this is my main table, the Pokemon table right here. So we're going to select again just so you guys see that I'm not lying. So in this Pokemon table, we're going to have the Pokemon ID, its name, its type ID, Pokedex number, and region ID. So obviously these are keys to other tables. So if I select region, you're going to see all the other regions in Pokemon right here. And that's just going to be for a given Pokemon. And then their given types are again going to be referenced right here. So very easy to follow. And that exact structure is the same for its models. So in the model, you're going to see the same thing that I just showed you in the database, and then references to these other models that are right here. So again, very straightforward, nothing too complicated with what's going on in our database and our models, but I wanted to show you guys so you guys understand what is going on here. And then here we just have our DB context. Again, very straightforward stuff. But with that being said, we want to get this working. So this is what we're going to do here. And this right here essentially mimics what's going on here. This get Pokemon that then goes to the Pokemon repository and brings back our values is right here. So this line right here is what's in the repository. And then this would be the controller endpoint per se. But we're never going to directly hit this. GraphQL is going to know based on what's passed in the query that's in the body of the HTTP request to go to this resolver. And I'm going to add a few more attributes at the top, and I'll explain them in a second. So right here, we're basically saying that we can also sort on this query, filter on this query, and use projection. Projection means that if essentially I only want name back From this, I'm allowed to only return one field because this query is only going to query one specific column. So that's just another really cool feature of GraphQL. And then using filtering or sorting or using paging are just other functionalities that you can do when doing GraphQL queries. And I want to do a get Pokemon by ID, so you guys have that experience of seeing that as well. So it's going to be, again, looking very similar. Again, we're going to be returning async task, a Pokemon object, because again, like I mentioned in the slides, you can only return typed objects. You cannot return singular values like a string or an integer. Every returned value has to be tied to an object. It has to be tied to your schema. So you cannot just put string here. GraphQL would freak out and give you an error that it doesn't accept scalar values and that you need to use objects. So be aware of that. You have to return something like this. So even let's say when we do a delete in the future, you guys are going to see what we're going to have to do to fix that. So I'll leave that for later in the video, but just teasing it. But for get Pokemon by ID, we again are going to do a DB context. And then we're passing in the ID as expected. We're going to go to our DB context Pokemon table, include the region and type where the Pokemon ID equals ID, and then return first or default. All very basic stuff, but this is the structure. And that is all you have to do to define these endpoints here. And before we go and do all the mutations, I want to show these working. And I want to show you guys the banana cake pop UI for actually querying this API for local development. And I want to show you guys what you need to add into your program.cs to get GraphQL working. So let's go to the program.cs. All right, guys, so we're in the program.cs. Let's see what we need to change. The first thing that we need to add is we need to add our GraphQL server. So we have GraphQL. And then we have this very important line. This is where we register our DB context with our context, like if you would do if you had a SQL server, something like that. Nothing too strange there. But then we have this here, this DB context kind. DB context kind represents the way a DB context is injected and handled by the execution engine. So here we are saying synchronized. But where have we seen this before? If we go to our query class, we'll see that it was right here. And some of you might be looking at this and being like, hey, can't we just do this? And it would still work, right? Well, no. Entity Framework would not like that because it does not support multiple parallel operations being run on a single context instance. So we need this right here. This service attribute essentially says that we need to inject it as a service, and then the synchronized basically tells the resolvers to stay in sync and don't access the DB at the exact same time. So that is what all that is for. Moving on in the program.cs, we need to add our query types. So we're going to bring that model in. And then mutations, we haven't gotten to that, so I'll comment that out right now. But when we actually create that, we will add that in. And then for these attributes over here to work, you need to declare them right here. So add projections, add filtering, add sorting. So that GraphQL has that ability. So very much GraphQL is you have to opt in to extra functionality. It's not going to give you everything and then you have to take stuff away that you don't need. You have to opt into things. And then the next thing that we need to do is just define where the GraphQL endpoint is going to be. And to do that, we're just going to do this. So we're just going to put it right here, and it's going to be app.map GraphQL to this GraphQL endpoint. And we're going to see what happens when you hit that endpoint. So now that we have our GraphQL endpoint map, it's time to test this. So let's run our API. And then we're going to want to go to this GraphQL endpoint. We're going to see that this is going to load with Swagger, and you're going to be confused. Like, hey, I thought we were doing GraphQL. No, just get rid of this and go to GraphQL. It's going to load banana cake pop. This is basically what hot chocolate gives you to actually query locally. So it's going to see something like this. You're going to see that right here. You're going to have Pokemon and Pokemon by ID. So GraphQL or hot chocolate will get rid of this right here. So you only have this for the names of your resolvers. So you have this. And then right here, you'll have our schema definition. So at this very bottom, you'll see your models right here because I told you guys that the schema is extremely important and you can only have type objects. So right here, you'll have these, and then you'll see things for sorting, filtering, and all of that stuff, as well as your type query with the two resolvers in here. So now let's actually query something and see if this is working. So what I'm going to do here is I selected Pokemon. So it's going to be for getting a Pokemon, or all of them. And then we're going to say we only want the name. So let's click run. And as we can see, we get our data. We're going to get all the Pokemon. So Metagross, Tyranitar, Hawlucha, Charizard, Scrafty, and Electivire. And if we go to our database and we go to this table, we see that these are the 6 that we have in here. And let's say we want to only get also the Pokedex number. So we just type Pokedex number in here, and it brings just that back. So this is what I was mentioning when we were doing the slides of you can specifically, no matter what type of complex data you have, you can tell it, I only want these things. Let's say I don't want Pokedex number anymore. Instead, I want to get the type. So we would do type, and then we would do this, and then we would want, I believe, the name. And then let's say we also wanted the region the Pokemon's from. And these are those other tables that we go to with their IDs. And we also want the region name. We run this, and now we're getting the region name, Hoenn, type Steel, and the name is Metagross. So this is how you also query for other tables. It is that simple, and you're not getting a bunch of random stuff that you didn't really want. You don't have to get their IDs back. You don't have to get any of that stuff. You're telling it only exactly what you want. So this is sort of the beauty of GraphQL. And now, since we're already here, let's go ahead and do get by ID, just so we can see how that looks. So I'm going to click the plus here, and then we're going to go into the query, and we're going to put this. So we're going to put this right here. Right here. It recognizes it, and then it sees that it is this. And then these are all kind of the options that we could have. So you would pass in like the ID of the one you would want. And then let's say we only want name, run. And now we are getting a Pokemon by ID, name, and we are hitting these right here. And if you want proof, I can put a breakpoint there. We can run it, and we're going to see that we're hitting this endpoint right here. And we're good. And all of this would look like we're just hitting this endpoint, and then this is what goes in the body and goes and hits this endpoint. We don't have to tell it GraphQL / get Pokemon by ID, ID 1. No, everything is defined in here. But now that I've showed you this, we have GraphQL working. Now let's dive into mutations and everything else that we need to do to make sure that we have all our different endpoints from our REST API working also in GraphQL. So now let's go ahead and do our create, our edit, and our deletes. So that's going to be our mutations. So first of all, I want to add this back in right here in our program.cs. So add mutation type, mutation. So to actually be able to do this, we need to go ahead and create our mutation class. So we're going to go to data, right click, add new item, and it's going to be called mutation. Click that. So now that we have this should be able to go away now. So now that we have this, we go back here, and now let's start with our create. In our create Pokemon, it's going to look something like this. Public async task Pokemon, because we are returning a Pokemon that we just created, and we want to see what we just created. So then we inject our DB context, and then contrary to how maybe you would do this if you were doing the Pokemon controller, and I go back here where you pass in from body the Pokemon object, here what you do is you pass in the individual items. So we pass in name, Pokedex number, region ID, and type ID, and then we assign it into the new model. That is something that is a little different, and you just have to understand. That's how you have to do it and write it in the query language, and you'll see that when we actually go through the example. But that is what you need to do for create. You create the new Pokemon, then add it, and then save your changes. Now let's move on to update. For update Pokemon, it looks something like this. Public async, again, we return the Pokemon that we updated. Again, the DB context, but here we're just updating the name and then the ID to actually go and find it, since you have to do a get. Update the name and then save your changes, and that's it. Now, finally, we need to go ahead and do our delete. And this one's going to look a little different, and I'll explain. So we're going to have public async task delete result, and I'll explain this in a second. Then we have delete Pokemon, our context. Again, we have this ID. That's to retrieve the Pokemon we're going to delete. Check if it's null. If it's not null, remove it, save our changes, and then return this. So let's explain this now. In my Pokemon controller, if I were to delete, here I'm just returning bool. So true or false, did we delete or not? A bool is not valid for GraphQL. Or remember, you need to do objects. So to mimic that true or false return type, we need to create this delete result model. So we're going to go to data, add new item. It's going to be called delete result, obviously. And then we are going to have two things in here. We are going to have success and deleted Pokemon. Success is going to mimic that same true or false. Did we delete it? And then deleted Pokemon is just for a little extra little pizzazz. And it's just going to tell us what Pokemon we deleted. But with that, all that squiggly line should be good. And now we are ready to move ahead in testing. And if you don't want it to load directly to Swagger when you launch your API, you can go in here and go to your launch URLs, depending on what you're running it in, and change it to GraphQL so that whenever you run your API, it opens up straight to Banana Cake Pop and you don't have to type the URL and go from Swagger to Banana Cake Pop. Now that we've added everything for mutations, let's see if we can actually create, edit, and then delete a Pokemon. But first, if you found this video helpful, please drop a like on this video, as well as subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the other wonderful content that I have for you guys. But now, let's create a Pokemon. So we're going to go in here. We're going to do mutation, create Pokemon. So again, it's going to do the exact same thing. And like I showed you guys in here, we're passing in the individual things. So going back here, we have the name, Lycanroc, Pokedex number, region type, and type ID. And then we want back name, Pokedex number, Pokemon ID, region ID, and type ID, which are all things that come from the Pokemon model that we are returning. So let's go ahead and press run. As we can see, it returned the Pokemon model like we asked, and it gave us back the name, the Pokedex number, Pokemon ID, region ID, and type ID. And if we want to confirm, we can go to our SQL server and execute, and we should see that we have this last item right here that we created. So it is working. Now let's move ahead and let's edit it. So to edit a Pokemon, it's going to look like this. We're going to do mutation, update Pokemon. We give it the ID of the Pokemon that we want to update. So in my case, it would be 1005. So we're going to do this. And then we're going to change the name to Dusk Lycanroc. And then we want only back the name. So now let's run it. So it ran and it returned name Dusk Lycanroc. So it worked. And why did we get name back? Because again, we were returning a task of Pokemon, so we could select from anything inside of Pokemon. And again, if we want to verify, we can execute and it changed the name. So now let's go ahead and do a delete. So I again created a new tab, and a delete is going to look like this. So we're going to again do a mutation, delete Pokemon. We're going to pass in the ID of the Pokemon we want to delete. So we again do a 5, and then we want back success, and we want the name of the deleted Pokemon inside of this object. So if you remember, success, and then the Pokemon. So we have access to everything inside of Pokemon. So we have access to everything in here. So if we want to get the name of what we deleted, we can. So now let's go ahead and run it. And we can see that we get success true, and we deleted this Pokemon that we just created, and we can check it in here, and we see that it is now gone. But that is how you add GraphQL to your .NET API. It's as simple as that, and now you can harness all the amazing things of GraphQL that maybe are perfect for your solution. And if you guys want to go and learn more about .NET APIs, click on these videos right here.